Angela Carter was a simple woman who did not like to cause trouble anywhere she went. She was a calm person who always respected rules, whether at work, in her neighborhood, or even when she traveled. That day she walked into the airport with her suitcase and a small handbag, holding her travel papers neatly arranged. The airport was full of noise. People were rushing to catch flights. Children were crying. Announcements echoed through the speakers, and security officers stood in line checking everyone carefully. Angela did not mind the rush. She had traveled many times before and she knew the steps. She walked slowly, keeping her head high, waiting for her turn at the security checkpoint. At the other side of the counter stood Sergeant Miller, one of the senior officers on duty. He was known among the staff for being harsh, but Angela had never met him before. He stood with a stiff posture, scanning every passenger like he was waiting to find fault in them. When Angela stepped forward, he looked at her papers, then at her face, and his expression changed. Instead of speaking in a professional way, he let out a sharp laugh that caught the attention of the people behind her. Angela stayed quiet, but inside she knew something about his tone was wrong. She handed her identification and boarding pass, expecting him to scan them quickly and let her through. Miller did not do that. He stared at her ID for a long time, then looked back at her with doubt. "This does not look right," he said loudly enough for others to hear. Angela calmly explained that it was her real identification, issued by the government, and that her name matched the boarding pass. She even showed her travel schedule printed out from the airline, but instead of listening, Miller shook his head, pretending he had found a big problem. People around them started shifting uncomfortably, wondering why the officer was speaking so harshly to a woman who had shown no sign of trouble. Angela tried to keep her voice soft and respectful. She said she was traveling for business and that everything was in order. But Miller continued to speak rudely, questioning how she could afford a first-class ticket and making remarks about how some people did not belong in certain places. Angela did not answer back. She knew raising her voice would only make things worse. She stood still, her hands holding her bag straps tightly, waiting for him to finish. The officer grew more impatient. His words became sharper, and finally he called over another officer to watch the line while he focused on her. Without warning, Miller told Angela to put her hands behind her back. She blinked in surprise, thinking he was joking, but when she looked at his serious face, she realized he meant it. She tried to ask what the problem was, but before she could finish her sentence, Miller had already pulled out his handcuffs and snapped them around her wrists. The cold steel tightened, and Angela felt the sting, not only on her skin but deep in her heart. She had done nothing wrong, yet here she was being treated like a criminal in front of strangers. The passengers standing nearby gasped. Some whispered to each other. Others pulled out their phones and started recording. Angela could hear the clicks of cameras and the hum of people filming. She wished the ground would open up and hide her from the humiliation, but she kept her face calm. Inside she was shaken, but she refused to give Miller the satisfaction of seeing her break. He pulled her aside, holding her arm roughly, and dragged her toward a private security area. Her handbag swung from her shoulder as she tried to keep her balance in the fast steps. The walk to the private room felt longer than it really was. Every second, Angela thought about how the crowd must see her now, a woman who looked guilty only because she was in handcuffs. She thought of her parents who raised her to be strong, of her colleagues who respected her, and of the work waiting for her in another city. She told herself she must remain calm, because truth was stronger than lies, and patience was stronger than anger. When they entered the small room, Miller pushed her into a chair and started writing on a form. He did not explain what crime she had committed. He did not tell her why he believed her documents were false. He only repeated that she looked suspicious. Angela sat quietly, staring at the table in front of her. The air in the room felt heavy, and the ticking clock on the wall echoed loudly. She thought about how unfair it was, but she reminded herself that justice, even if slow, always found its way. What Miller did not know was that every action he had taken was being watched. The airport was full of cameras. Dozens of travelers outside had recorded his insults and his decision to cuff a woman who had given him no reason to doubt her. Those videos were already being shared online, spreading from one person to another in real time. Angela did not know this yet, but fate was already turning in her favor. The same act that Miller thought would make him look powerful was the very act that would dig his own grave. Angela closed her eyes for a moment, taking a slow breath. She reminded herself of the meeting she was supposed to attend later, the people who respected her, and the work she still had to do. This situation was not the end of her journey. It was only the beginning of a storm that would change everything, not only for her but for the man who had chosen to humiliate her without reason. Angela sat in the cold chair of the small security room, her wrists still pressed tightly by the handcuffs. The room was plain, with gray walls and a table in the middle that carried nothing but a few scattered papers. Sergeant Miller stood over her, writing something down on a form with an expression that mixed arrogance and false confidence. His voice was sharp when he spoke, and he treated her as if she had already been proven guilty of something terrible. Angela kept her eyes low, her breathing steady, reminding herself not to show fear. Fear, she thought, would only make him feel stronger. Miller asked questions, but they were not questions that made sense. Instead of asking about her travel plans or the purpose of her trip, he mocked her answers. When she said she was traveling for work, he raised his eyebrows and sneered, suggesting she was lying. When she explained about the business meeting, he laughed as if the idea of her being important enough to attend such a meeting was a joke. He accused her of trying to use a fake identity, even though her passport had clear stamps and her boarding pass matched perfectly. Angela spoke clearly, showing no anger, but inside her chest her heart beat fast. Every time Angela tried to explain, Miller cut her off. He spoke louder, drowning out her words, making her look like she had no defense. The door to the small room opened once, and another officer peeked in, looking uncertain. Miller waved him away quickly, telling him he was handling it. Angela noticed how the younger officer glanced at her, as if he could already sense something was wrong. She did not say anything but kept that thought close. Someone somewhere would see the truth. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Angela's wrists hurt from the cuffs and her shoulders ached from being pulled roughly earlier. She asked politely if the cuffs could be removed since she was not resisting, but Miller refused. He told her she did not deserve respect until she proved she belonged there. His words stung, but Angela forced herself not to respond with anger. She had learned long ago that dignity was the strongest weapon. She thought of her family's advice. Never let anyone steal your peace, even if they try their hardest. What Miller did not know was that outside the room, the airport was no longer calm. Travelers who had witnessed the scene were speaking to airport staff, telling them what had happened. Some had already gone to the customer service desk to file official complaints. Others had shared their recordings online, and the videos were quickly spreading across social media. The short clips showed Angela standing calmly, offering her documents while Miller raised his voice and then suddenly cuffed her without cause. Strangers on the internet were already asking who the woman was and why she was being treated this way. The story was beginning to form its own path, one that Miller could not control. Inside the room, Angela closed her eyes briefly, whispering a silent prayer for strength. She knew she was innocent. She knew her documents were real. She knew she was traveling for the most legitimate reasons. All she had to do now was hold steady until help came. She thought of her colleagues who were already expecting her at the other end of the journey. They would worry when she did not arrive on time, but she also knew they would not rest until they found out what had happened. Miller, however, kept pressing his false accusations. He accused her of trying to sneak into first class without paying. Angela almost smiled at the absurdity. Her ticket had been paid weeks ago, confirmed, and printed clearly in her hand. But she did not laugh because she knew laughing might be taken as disrespect. Instead, she calmly repeated that her documents were correct. Her stillness seemed to irritate Miller even more, as if he wanted her to shout or cry. But Angela refused to give him that victory. The air in the room grew heavier. The ticking of the clock seemed louder, and every scrape of Miller's pen on paper echoed like thunder. Finally, Angela asked for a supervisor. Her voice was steady and respectful, but Miller slammed the pen down and barked that she did not have the right to make demands. Angela did not argue. She simply sat back, her silence sharper than any reply. Unseen by Miller, one of the supervisors had already been alerted. The calls from angry passengers and the unusual activity at the checkpoint had reached management. While Miller believed he was in complete control, the truth was that the walls were closing in. Supervisors were walking toward the security office, carrying reports, listening to passenger testimonies, and preparing to question what exactly was going on. Angela could sense a shift. She did not know the full details yet, but she could feel the energy changing outside the door. Her patience was not for nothing. She reminded herself that truth always rises, even if it takes time. She thought of the people who had seen what happened. They had eyes, ears, and hearts, and surely they could not all ignore what they had witnessed. When the door opened again, Miller looked surprised. This time it was not a junior officer. 2 supervisors entered, their faces serious. They asked Miller for a report, and he quickly began to explain in a way that painted Angela as suspicious. But Angela noticed how the supervisors did not look convinced. They glanced at her, then at the cuffs, then back at Miller. One of them asked for her documents directly, and she handed them over without hesitation. Her hands were shaky, not from fear but from the pain of the tight metal, yet she managed to keep her voice calm. The supervisors studied her passport and boarding pass carefully. Everything matched. Her name was clear, her ticket valid, her travel reason believable. When they asked Miller why she had been cuffed, his answers grew less confident. He repeated vague claims about her behavior and attitude, but the supervisors had already seen enough. They told Miller to step outside for a moment, leaving Angela sitting in the room. She felt a quiet relief wash over her. The first crack in his authority had finally appeared. In that moment, Angela realized that her silence had been her strongest shield. She had not needed to fight or argue. The truth was beginning to reveal itself naturally, and though she did not yet know how far this situation would go, she understood that the first step had been taken. Someone finally believed her. Someone finally saw through the false show of power. The weight on her chest lifted slightly, even though the cuffs were still around her wrists. As the supervisors spoke outside with Miller, their voices low but firm, Angela straightened in her chair. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. She knew this moment was only the start of something larger, but she also knew one thing for certain. Miller had already gone too far, and the consequences of his actions would follow him longer than he could imagine. Angela waited in the small gray room, her wrists still sore from the cuffs. She sat with her back straight, her mind calm but alert. She had already faced humiliation, but she trusted that truth would not stay hidden forever. She noticed that the energy in the building felt different now. Voices outside the door were sharper. Footsteps moved faster, and the tone of the officers who passed by sounded uncertain. Something was changing. She sensed that the control Sergeant Miller thought he had was slowly slipping away. When the door opened again, one of the supervisors returned with 2 more officers. They asked Angela politely if she was comfortable, then looked at the cuffs with concern. They told Miller to remove them, but he protested, claiming that she was a security threat. His voice cracked slightly, no longer carrying the same confidence as before. The supervisors did not argue with him. Instead, they insisted. At last, Miller unlocked the cuffs, and Angela felt the blood return to her wrists. She rubbed them gently but did not say a word. Her silence spoke louder than anything. Angela handed her documents again, this time directly to the supervisors. They studied them carefully, checking every detail, scanning the codes, and cross-checking with the flight database. Everything was correct. Angela's passport was genuine, her ticket was valid, and her name was clearly listed on the flight manifest. The supervisors exchanged looks, realizing there was no reason she should have been treated this way. Miller tried to interrupt, raising his voice about her attitude and how she had acted suspiciously, but his words fell flat. There was no evidence to back his claims. Meanwhile, outside in the main terminal, tension was rising. Travelers who had seen the incident were still gathered near the checkpoint. Some argued with airport staff, demanding justice for the woman they had seen treated unfairly. Others continued recording, their voices in the videos describing what had happened. The clips spread across phones and laptops, drawing more and more attention online. People were angry, and strangers began to call the airport to complain. Miller, inside the small room, had no idea that his actions were already being judged by thousands beyond those walls. Angela sat quietly as the supervisors asked her a few questions. She answered with patience, explaining her travel purpose. She mentioned she was attending a meeting that had been planned weeks ago, and that she was expected at her destination. Her voice was steady, not defensive, and she showed no bitterness. The supervisors nodded, clearly believing her. One of them excused himself and stepped outside, leaving Miller pacing in the corner like a man who could feel the ground shifting under his feet. Minutes later, the supervisor returned with an even higher-ranking official from airport management. This official entered the room with an air of authority, holding a file in one hand and a tablet in the other. He looked at Angela with respect, introduced himself, and asked if she was all right. She nodded, though her heart was still heavy from the humiliation she had endured. He then turned to Miller and demanded an explanation. Miller stuttered, repeating the same baseless accusations. But the official shook his head, pointing out that Angela's information had been verified and that there was no reason for such treatment. Angela noticed how Miller's face grew redder with every word. His shoulders tensed and his jaw tightened, but his confidence was gone. The official reminded him that airports had strict rules about how travelers were treated, and that handcuffing someone without proof of wrongdoing was a serious matter. Angela stayed silent, watching the scene unfold. For the first time since the ordeal began, she felt a glimmer of hope that justice was close. Outside, the crowd was not calming down. More passengers had stepped forward with their complaints. Some told their stories to airline staff, others to airport police. The videos continued to circulate online, catching the attention of journalists and advocacy groups. The incident was no longer a private matter. It was becoming a public story. Angela did not know the full scale of it yet, but she could feel that events were building like a storm about to break. Back inside the room, the official apologized to Angela on behalf of the airport. He said they were looking into the matter seriously. Angela nodded politely, but she also reminded him of something important: her rights. In a clear, firm voice, she said she wanted legal representation immediately. The room went silent. The supervisors glanced at one another, recognizing that this was no ordinary traveler. She knew the law and she was not afraid to use it. Miller's expression changed sharply. He seemed startled, realizing he had underestimated her completely. The official respected her request and said they would provide access to legal assistance. Miller tried once more to argue, but his words no longer held power. His superiors were no longer backing him. Angela looked at him calmly, her eyes steady as if to remind him that dignity was something no one could steal. The hours that followed were heavy but revealing. Angela sat in the same room while management reviewed security footage, collected witness reports, and gathered the recordings from travelers. Each new piece of evidence built a stronger case against Miller. His aggressive behavior was clear, his lack of justification undeniable. Angela remained patient, speaking only when necessary, never raising her voice, never losing her calm. She understood that every moment of silence was proof of her strength. By the time evening shadows fell across the airport, the situation had shifted completely. Miller, once so confident, now stood cornered. His career was beginning to crack under the weight of his own actions. Angela, on the other hand, was gaining quiet respect from everyone who entered the room. The supervisors no longer looked at her as just another passenger. They saw her as someone who had endured unfair treatment with remarkable composure. As the official prepared to release her, Angela knew the matter was far from over. What had happened was wrong, and she would not let it be forgotten. Miller might have believed he was in control when he placed her in cuffs, but now it was clear. Every step he had taken was leading to his own downfall. Angela left the room with her head held high. She had not shouted, she had not broken down, and she had not let anger consume her. Yet she had turned the tide. Outside the door, the terminal still buzzed with tension. Strangers looked at her with sympathy, some even nodding in quiet support. She walked past them with quiet grace, knowing that the truth was only beginning to surface. Miller had dug a deep hole with his arrogance, and soon he would learn just how far he had fallen into it. Angela walked out of the small gray room, her wrists still aching from the cuffs even though they were now free. She could feel the marks left by the tight metal, a silent reminder of how far the humiliation had gone. Yet she walked with steady steps, not letting her pain show on her face. The supervisors and the higher official followed close behind her. Their faces were serious, and they spoke in low voices to one another, discussing what had just happened. Angela knew the matter was not over. What had taken place inside that room was only the beginning. The airport was alive with whispers when Angela re-entered the terminal. Travelers who had seen her earlier recognized her instantly. Many looked at her with respect, some with sympathy. She noticed people holding up their phones, some still recording, others speaking into cameras. News was already spreading beyond the airport walls. Angela's quiet dignity stood in sharp contrast to the officer's loud arrogance. The difference was so clear that even strangers could see who was in the right. The senior official guided Angela to a separate lounge where she could rest. He offered her water and apologized again. Angela accepted the drink but remained silent for a while. She needed her thoughts to be clear. She was not someone who believed in revenge, but she believed deeply in justice, and what had happened here could not be ignored. She had been humiliated for no reason, treated as if her very presence was suspicious. She knew this was not only about her. If she let it pass, others could face the same abuse. Miller, meanwhile, was outside in another room, pacing angrily. He was questioned by his superiors about his actions, but his answers were weak. He kept repeating that Angela had looked out of place, that her calmness made her seem suspicious, and that he was just doing his job. But the supervisors had seen the videos, the security footage, and the reactions of passengers. They knew there was no truth in his defense. Each excuse he gave only made him look more desperate. Angela sat in the lounge, her hands folded in her lap. She thought about the meeting she was supposed to attend in another city. She wondered if the people waiting for her already knew she had been delayed. She also thought of her family, who would be worried if they learned of the incident from the news. But most of all, she thought about the countless times people like her had faced similar unfairness, moments that were often buried in silence. She decided that her silence would not mean acceptance. She would use her voice, her knowledge, and her position to make sure this story was told. The official returned and explained that she would be allowed to continue her journey. He offered to personally arrange her boarding and make sure she was treated with respect. Angela thanked him politely, but before leaving, she spoke with calm determination. She told him that the matter would not end at an apology. She wanted a full report, she wanted access to the recordings, and she wanted to speak to legal counsel. The official nodded, realizing now that this woman was not ordinary. There was weight in her words, a quiet power that could not be ignored. By the time Angela boarded her flight, the videos of the incident had already reached major news outlets. Headlines began appearing online. Traveler humiliated at airport. Passenger handcuffed without cause. Questions rise over officer's behavior. Comment sections filled with anger and support for Angela. Advocacy groups reached out offering assistance. Lawyers spoke publicly about how such actions violated civil rights. Miller's name began to surface, tied directly to the event, and his career trembled like glass about to shatter. Angela sat in her seat on the plane, looking out the window as the engines roared to life. She allowed herself a long breath. The humiliation was still fresh, the sting of the cuffs still on her skin, but she also felt strength building inside her. She was not powerless. She carried knowledge, experience, and the truth, and these were stronger than any insult. She thought of the courtroom, a place she knew well, and imagined how this incident would unfold there. She did not seek to destroy anyone, but she knew the law would hold him accountable. When she landed at her destination, she was greeted not only by her colleagues, but also by reporters waiting at the arrival gate. News had traveled fast. Microphones and cameras surrounded her, voices shouting questions. Angela did not rush away. She stood tall, gave a calm statement, and confirmed that what had happened to her was wrong and would be addressed properly. Her words were simple, but they carried power because she spoke with truth. Reporters quickly realized this woman was no ordinary traveler. She was a respected attorney, one who had defended countless victims of discrimination in the past. Now she herself had become a victim, and that made her story even stronger. Back at the original airport, chaos unfolded. Miller was suspended pending investigation. His colleagues whispered about how he had finally gone too far. Some were relieved that his arrogance had been exposed, while others shook their heads, realizing the damage his actions had caused to the department's reputation. The supervisors filed their reports, and airport management held emergency meetings. The incident had become too big to hide, too loud to ignore. Angela's colleagues welcomed her warmly, but they also understood the seriousness of what she had gone through. They assured her that she would not face this fight alone. They began gathering evidence, reaching out to witnesses, and preparing the first steps of legal action. Angela listened carefully, her mind sharp. She knew this was bigger than herself. It was about fairness, about dignity, about the promise that no one should be treated as less in places meant for everyone. As the day ended, Angela sat quietly in her hotel room reflecting. She remembered the moment the cuffs closed around her wrists, the sting of humiliation, and the way Miller had laughed at her. She remembered the crowd's shocked faces and the silence she had chosen instead of anger, and now she thought of the path ahead, a path that would demand courage, patience, and resilience. She was ready for it. Miller's downfall had already begun, though he could not yet see how deep it would go. Angela knew he had dug his own grave the moment he placed those cuffs on her wrists. Each word he spoke, each insult he delivered, each baseless accusation he made had built the walls around him. Now all she had to do was let truth and justice finish the work. Angela turned off the lights, letting the city glow outside her window. She closed her eyes, holding on to her quiet strength. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more voices, more challenges. But she was ready. She had faced the storm with dignity, and now the storm itself would clear the path for justice. Angela woke early the next morning with a clear mind and a strong heart. The sunlight slipped through the curtains of her hotel room, and she sat quietly for a moment, gathering her thoughts. She had endured humiliation at the airport, but she knew it was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of something greater. She dressed neatly for her meeting, but before she left, she called her legal team. She explained everything in detail, the insults, the cuffs, the long hours in the small room, and the way she had been treated like she did not belong. Her lawyers listened carefully and promised to act swiftly. By the time Angela reached her office later that day, the news had already spread far beyond the airport. Headlines on television and online platforms carried her story. Reporters repeated her name, and advocacy groups held statements condemning the treatment she had faced. Videos of the incident had gone viral, showing her calmness against the officer's aggression. Millions of people had watched, and the anger was growing. Social media was filled with voices supporting her, calling for accountability. Angela knew this wave of attention could be used not only to seek justice for herself, but also to bring light to countless others who had faced similar treatment in silence. Her lawyers moved quickly. They filed a formal complaint against the officer and the department. They demanded a full investigation and compensation for the humiliation and harm caused. More importantly, they demanded new policies to protect travelers from abuse of power. Angela attended every meeting with quiet strength, speaking firmly but respectfully, never letting anger control her words. She explained that this was not only about one woman at one airport. It was about fairness, dignity, and trust in public spaces. Miller, on the other hand, felt the ground crumble beneath him. At first, he thought the storm would pass. He believed the department would protect him, as they often had in the past. But this time was different. The videos were undeniable, the witnesses too many, and the victim far too respected to be ignored. His name was in the news for all the wrong reasons, and his superiors had no choice but to distance themselves from him. He was suspended, stripped of his duties, and faced a formal inquiry. Each day the walls closed tighter around him. The power he had once enjoyed turned to dust. The case soon reached the courtroom, drawing national attention. Journalists filled the seats, cameras waited outside the doors, and people across the country tuned in to watch. Angela walked into the courtroom with her head high, dressed with grace, her expression calm. She took the stand and described everything that had happened, how she had been insulted, how her documents had been ignored, and how the cuffs had bitten into her skin while she sat silently in that room. Her voice was steady, her words simple, and her truth undeniable. Witnesses were called, each one supporting her account. Travelers who had been at the checkpoint described how they saw her stand quietly, while Miller raised his voice. They explained how she showed her identification, how she did nothing to provoke him, and how shocked they were when he suddenly cuffed her. The videos were played in court, and the images spoke louder than any words. The judge and jury saw Angela standing calm and composed, and Miller towering over her with hostility. It was clear to everyone where the fault lay. Miller tried to defend himself, but his excuses sounded hollow. He claimed he had acted out of caution, but the evidence showed otherwise. He claimed she had looked suspicious, but nothing in the footage supported his words. Under cross-examination, his confidence broke. His contradictions piled up, and his face revealed the truth that his words could not hide. The jury did not take long to decide. They ruled in Angela's favor, declaring that she had been wrongfully detained, humiliated without cause, and subjected to discrimination. They awarded her damages, but more importantly, they demanded that the airport and security agencies create stronger safeguards against such abuse. It was not just a victory for Angela. It was a victory for everyone who had ever faced unfair treatment in silence. The news spread quickly. Across the country, people celebrated the outcome. Advocacy groups called Angela a symbol of dignity and courage. She was invited to speak at conferences, on television programs, and at universities. She used every platform to speak not only about her story, but also about the larger issue of fairness and respect. She reminded audiences that airports, train stations, and all public places should be safe for everyone, regardless of who they are. Miller's career was over. He lost his position, his badge, and the respect of his colleagues. The same arrogance that once made him feel untouchable had destroyed him. He had dug his own grave with every insult, every false accusation, and every abuse of power. His name became a warning to others who thought they could act without consequence. Angela, however, moved forward with grace. She continued her work as a civil rights attorney, now with even more determination. Her experience at the airport had been painful, but it had also given her a stronger voice. She used her case as an example to push for policy changes, ensuring officers were trained in fairness and respect. She met with leaders and lawmakers, reminding them that true security came not from fear or arrogance but from justice and equality. In quiet moments, Angela reflected on everything she had endured. She remembered the sting of the cuffs, the humiliation of being dragged in front of strangers, and the cold silence of the small gray room. But she also remembered her own calmness, her decision not to let anger control her, and her trust that truth would shine. She realized that patience had been her greatest strength, and dignity her greatest weapon. Years later, people still spoke of her story. Students studied it in classrooms, lawyers referenced it in cases, and ordinary travelers remembered it when walking through airports. Angela had become more than a victim. She had become a symbol of quiet strength, a reminder that injustice cannot last forever. And so the story ended not with bitterness, but with justice. A woman who was once insulted and handcuffed at an airport walked away with her head high, her dignity intact and her purpose stronger than ever. And the man who thought he had power over her discovered too late that arrogance is a trap, and that the grave he dug for another was, in truth, his own.